The Haida Land Agreement, which was signed mid-April by the BC government and Haida First Nation, is being applauded as a step in the right direction for reconciliation. But what should it mean to those who have private property on the Haida lands, an island region in northern BC? I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and today I bring you a sit-down interview with a lawyer who has specialized in Aboriginal law for 15 years, who says it should cause some concern.
What does it mean when you have Haida leaders taking the place of British Columbia leaders on the island? Well, it means that half of the population who are not members of the Haida Nation will now be ruled by leaders that they do not elect. This is within Canada.
All right, this is Tim Thielmann. Now, Tim is also a candidate for the Conservative Party for Victoria and Beacon Hill. Before we get into the Haida Agreement, something that stood out, with your experience in social justice and everything like that, was why run for the Conservative Party?
Right. So, I'm not a typical conservative, perhaps. I spent about 15 years working with First Nations as a lawyer. I'm legally blind. I've had successes despite that, inside and outside of the courtroom. But I've seen, like a lot of people, that over the last few years, policies enacted by good people with good intentions have caused disastrous consequences for the very kinds of vulnerable people that I was fighting for then and that I care about today. And a lot of people that I'm meeting on the left have that same experience. And so I feel really comfortable actually with the Conservative Party of BC right now because they're fighting for ordinary working people to put food on the table, to make life affordable, to fix healthcare, to just get back to the basics. And so I'm really actually happy to be running right now with the Conservatives.
Well, speaking of affordability and ordinary people, there are a lot of ordinary people wondering what this Haida Land Act agreement is going to mean to them, especially when it comes to private property. Now, I saw what you were talking about on Twitter, X, and that's why I reached out to you. You have definite insight here. So, for those who are not quite familiar, tell us a little bit about this agreement.
Sure. So this week, the NDP government is about to pass the Haida Title Act. It will recognize, for the first time in history, Haida Aboriginal title over roughly 10,000 square kilometers on Haida Gwaii and relinquish British Columbia's control over land and resources in that territory. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that every single tenure and permit that was granted without the Haida's consent in the past is now in jeopardy. It means that every home and private property, piece of private property, is now uncertain because, contrary to what the NDP has said repeatedly, the agreement does not clearly protect private property rights. And you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe John Rustad, the leader of the Conservative Party of BC. Talk to Tom Isaac. He's a nationally renowned Aboriginal law scholar for decades. He's written 12 books. He's been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. He's written a memo on this agreement and says it does not adequately protect private property. In fact, it has conflicting provisions, which include a recognition of Haida title over fee simple lands. So it's not clear whether in the coming days and years, the Haida will assume title over private property, if they will assume control, if they will change the management. In fact, the agreement does contemplate the deregistering of private property by the Haida, the private property they accumulate through different means. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns about this agreement. And one more I should mention is that, what does it mean when you have Haida leaders taking the place of British Columbia leaders on the island? Well, it means that half of the population who are not members of the Haida Nation will now be ruled by leaders that they do not elect. Mm-hmm. This is within Canada.
And that concern over people who are unelected now having decision making power, per se, over Crown land came up in a report we did about the BC Land Act that the NDP government seemed to have wanted to quietly pass, but has now parked temporarily and got much pushback. But that BC Land Act is part of sort of a commitment to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in BC, we adopted DRIPA. So, how do those two things tie in with this Haida agreement?
Right. So that's a really important place to start. So UNDRIP was passed in 2007 and then adopted by Canada in 2010. It essentially says that all lands traditionally used, occupied, or otherwise acquired by Indigenous peoples will be returned, or compensation paid in lieu, and that Indigenous laws will be applied on all the lands that Indigenous peoples control. So that's the blueprint from UNDRIP. And then in 2019, the British Columbia government, the NDP government, said we are going to make this domestic law. We're going to make this legally binding in BC. So for the last 5 years, that's what they've been busy doing, is taking this vision of an elite racial minority controlling the lands within British Columbia and applying it across every sector of British Columbian economy and society.
Now, the moral narrative that comes along with that is that this has to and should be done for reconciliation. What do you make of that argument?
So, I mean, I used to make a whole lot of it, honestly. Like as I said, I worked for the first dozen years of my career were spent advancing Indigenous rights. It's what I learned at university. It's what my clients wanted. It's what I believed, because I thought, like many people do today, that Indigenous people had lost power in the past, and so the only ethical thing to do today is to give power back to them. But the moral arithmetic isn't actually that simple. You know, it's true that the inhabitants at contact have lost control over those lands to the British and successor governments that we now, recognize as Canada. But it's not that simple, because they also, through this messy process of modernization, have gained the keys to the modern world that we all have. The wheel, the light bulb, the microchip, modern medicine. So this has tripled human lifespans from 25 years, which is roughly the average lifespan in hunter-gatherer societies, to 75. So that's not, those things won't be coming back from the Haida in this agreement as the land is returned. And I'm not saying they should be. The point isn't here that we should be tabulating up the debits and the credits of the past. I think that's a fool's errand. I think that that we need to have reconciliation today. There's this notion of reconciliation that's come out of the courts and been popularized in the media, of an unending process that leaves First Nations perpetually aggrieved and everybody else perpetually ashamed. I fundamentally reject that, and I think that we all need to, because it's completely unproductive. I think we need to learn to love and respect each other again as equals, because there's no success found in warring over the balance owed from the distant past. So that's what I believe. I believe that we can have reconciliation today. Every individual British Columbian as equals, standing side by side and walking forwards together towards a more prosperous, more inclusive future for everybody.
Well, the leader of the Conservative Party, for which you are running, John Rustad, is the former Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Reconciliation, and he has a lot of skin in the game when it comes to that, while he was a minister, signing over 430 agreements to further economic reconciliation. When I ran into him recently at the legislature, I asked him his thoughts on, is this truly about reconciliation?
There's no question in my mind that a negotiated agreement for title for Haida Gwaii was the right thing to do. Where I had a problem is recognizing title over top of private land. Because over time, what that means is two things. First of all, Haida law will apply, and who knows what that will mean for in terms of what you can and can't do with your private property. And two, because of it being recognized as title, there will now be alienation of that title in terms of Indigenous rights to be able to benefit from the land. So that triggers the need for compensation. And so because that triggers the need for compensation, now government's now going to have to try and negotiate how much that will mean. For Haida Gwaii, you might think, well, it's 2% of the land, it's not a big deal, but let's start talking about what downtown Vancouver would look like, or downtown Victoria, or any of the other major cities in the province. And the compensation would be astronomical. And it's not taking into consideration both sides of the equation. So for that reason, I'm thinking, no, I'm not going to support this going forward. I fully support title and addressing title and what Haida has been able to achieve, but private land should have been excluded.
So what is your response then to the BC NDP, David Eby, saying, don't worry, there is no risk to private property rights in this?
Well, either he is being intentionally misleading or he is intentionally ignorant of the facts, because when you look at the law, when you look at Section 35, you cannot, by agreement with the First Nation, override Section 35 of the Constitution. And so that liability is out there. The ability for First Nations to be able to apply their laws on private land is out there regardless of the agreement. And because future leadership may have a different perspective in terms of what to do, and they are now allowed to be able to implement what they would like. So I would suggest that David Eby is downplaying what is now a really significant liability for the people of British Columbia in terms of private land and the addressing title for Indigenous people in this province.
Now, you talked a little bit about the narrative, maybe how the legacy media is coming up, but there is this sort of belief that if you are white, male, you really have no place to speak on an issue like that. Perhaps some may perceive it as racist for doing so. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are issues that we all have to grapple with as equals. I fundamentally reject any notion that any person has a special right or a special duty to speak or to not speak. You know, we are all citizens of this country. We all have experiences that need to be shared. And the only way that we learn from each other is by listening to each other and by sharing with each other. So, you know, I have a unique set of experiences from my legal background, from my experience working with First Nations people. You know, I've seen the promised land that UNDRIP is supposed to bring to us, and I tell you, it's not as grand as it's supposed to be. And that's why I'm speaking out. I take no joy in having to raise these concerns because it comes at personal cost to me, you know, to the colleagues and the personal friends that it hurts. You know, and they're good people. You know, they mean well just like I do. And so these are important ideas that we have to discuss. We're talking about the dispossession of the public and the dismantling of BC laws across an entire province. How can we not be talking about these things right now?
Well, there you have it. Tim Thielmann running for the Conservative Party for Victoria Beacon Hill. You can find out more information about him in our written article, which is linked in the description box below. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News. This year is general election year for British Columbians, and I will have my boots on the ground to bring you reports you can trust on it. To keep following along and find out more information on what's already up on Leadership Reports, you can go to our special website called BC Leadership Reports. I'll see you there.